Hey everyone, thanks for being here on Patreon. And I want to continue with the series of Boom Method videos that led up to the creation of this page. Probably a lot of you here saw those, and that might have brought you over to this platform. So I want to continue along that line and give you a little bit more to work with. If you haven't seen those videos, they're posted in the feed on this page, so please go back and check them out. This will be episode 8 of 8 so far. And today I want to get into some of the really nitty-gritty foundational aspects of what the Boom Method conveys. If you have the book, you've probably seen a lot of breath attacks and bends specifically in the book, and that's kind of what I want to focus on today. That's not the sum total of what the book is about, but it really informs a lot of the way that we approach the exercises. So let's start with the breath attacks. Why breath attacks? Well, we play wind instruments. If you're a brass player, you're playing a wind instrument. All of your expressivity comes from the way that you breathe into the instrument, and all of your technique is driven by the kind of airstream that you give it. So I feel like creating sound on the breath is really the basic foundation of what we do as brass players. My teacher Jim Thompson used to say that we're the closest family to the human voice because we're the only other family of instruments that uses vibrating human tissue on the air column to create sound. And I think that's a really apt observation, and something that we can really bring with us in our mindset when we practice. So if you basically imagine your embouchure, your lips as almost like vocal cords, then you can really start to understand how the airstream drives what they do. So in a breath attack, there's a variety of ways that we can approach breath attacks. You can approach them very rhythmically. You can approach them very, sort of fading in. You can, like a clarinet fading in from nothing. You can approach them, with with a wide dynamic range and different articulations. But the basic way that I like to use breath attacks, specifically in my warm-up and as an analysis tool for what's going on in my technique, is by using them in a rhythmic way, though not too loud. So what do I mean by that? Instead of making your breath attack swell into the note like a, we want to make it articulate the note like, right? Now, all we're doing here is taking the tongue out of the equation and creating the vibration on the lips from the type of air that we're, sending past the lips. Right? You can still get a clear articulation with no tongue, and then when you add the tongue back into the equation, you can use much less motion from the tongue to get the same kind of clarity on the front of the note. And that less motion translates to more control. It translates to greater speed, greater efficiency, all of the things that we're sort of constantly after. So the breath attack, I mentioned I use it as an analysis tool for what's going on in my playing. I really think of the airstream originating at the bottom of the lungs. You probably can't really see here, but the lungs go all the way down the lower back, and you can use your entire core to activate the airstream. So when you create an articulated rhythmic breath attack, like that kind of thing, you can feel a little impulse from your abdominal core, and that kind of gives us a lot of control and power over the way that the breath enters the instrument and the way that it passes the lips. I like to always think about the air going past the lips so that we never get bogged down with what's happening inside the mouthpiece. Of course, as brass players, we think about embouchure all the time, and we think about what's happening with our lips all the time. But the more we can remember that the sound and the air has to travel all the way through the tubing of the instrument before it reaches the audience, the less kind of pedantic we get in our own self-analysis. And by focusing on the release of the air, a la a rhythmic breath attack, that can really help you understand where things are hanging up if they are. So let's say I come to warm up one day and I'm getting, air balls like, right, it's not really working. Well, I check in with what's happening in my air first as the ground level first inspection. So in that case of the demonstration that I just gave, I'm getting no clear rhythmic impulse from the air. So if I just change that, then we get a much clearer articulation to begin with right off the bat. There are other things that could be at play, but I feel like if you approach everything from the standpoint of checking in with the air first, then you're going to start finding that more often than not, your issues can be solved with attention to the kind of airstream that you're using and the timing with which you're releasing it. So through the warm-ups and everything, I use multiple breath attacks also as an analytical tool, so that if I do 3 in a row and one of them is a little bit wonky or different, then I can check back in and see like, okay, well, when it worked best, this is what it felt like, and then I can start analyzing myself and understand how quickly I can get to the place where it feels good. So that might be like, now I kind of gave a demonstration on the second one of like the air kind of being a little lacking or not rhythmic right at the beginning, and then I corrected that on the third one with the way that I'd like it to be. That's a very short demonstration of how that can happen, and if we ever interact in person, we can get really into the weeds of how it's working in your own apparatus. But really, the breath attacks are just a way to put the air in control, right? The more that the air can be in control, the less you have to control things with the lips. So I really like, starting everything from that standpoint. So now the bends. Bends are a widely discussed topic, and I think that everybody might have their own take on it, and there's a lot of good takes out there. So this is the way that I think about bends. Bends, to me, are a way of creating elasticity in the embouchure as generated by the airstream. So what do I mean by that? Well, if you imagine, let's say I've got this little hair tie on my horn here. If you imagine the aperture of the lips, being kind of like a rubber band, when you bend, we're creating pull on the elasticity, and we're allowing it to snap back to center when we come back. So in that way, you're basically like creating some bounce and elasticity in the embouchure, and that can help us get to a point where we feel flexible and responsive and able to play with ease. So when I bend, I'm trying to imagine pushing against that elastic kind of opening in the aperture. Now, the aperture itself operates like a camera lens, or at least that's the way I like to think about it. That's the way my teacher Jim Thompson thought about it, or still does think about it. And the aperture operating like a camera lens basically is like if you are ascending or descending, it's focusing in or focusing out. Ascending, it's focusing in. Descending, it's focusing out. And the same thing with dynamics. If you're playing louder, it's opening, and if you're playing softer, it's focusing in. So we want to try to create elasticity in line with that kind of aperture movement. So rather than manipulating the chops, I'm using the airstream like a drill bit to bore out the center of the chops and then come back to that equilibrium. So when I bend down, you don't see any motion here. And the reason for that is that I'm really like focusing on the way and the shape of the airstream changes the aperture inside the mouthpiece without me making any manipulation outside the mouthpiece. So essentially what's happening inside the mouthpiece is that the air is kind of opening and allowing the contraction back of the aperture. Um, and by focusing on the bends in this way, we're aligning the bends with what happens physically when we ascend and descend on the instrument. So it's actually mapping onto our flexibility really, really directly. Um, Another type of bend you see in the book is an upper bend. John Lewis, the great studio trumpet player, first introduced me to these, and I've seen them in a few other places as well. But I've really started incorporating them after John and I started talking about them at work, because I found that they really helped me center my tone in a way that the lower bends kind of did, but not quite as efficiently. So the upper bend is really simple. It's basically keeping the note the same while fingering a half step up. And what that equates to is basically jumping to the middle of another lower bend. So if you were to do an upper bend, it'd be like this. Right, you're just keeping that C right, or B flat concert right in the center, fingering for a B concert or a C sharp B flat trumpet, and just trying to make it like a steady long tone. But what's happening there is that you're basically jumping to the middle of a bend down from C sharp. So we're skipping the half step up and going straight to the middle of the bend. And what that does is it forces you to direct your air like past the initial bend into the center of the second note, and then allow the chops to snap back into place when you lift the valves up. And in that way, it's really creating a direct relationship with the kind of airstream that you're putting into the horn and the way that it's manipulating the aperture, which again translates directly to our ascending descending flexibility on the instrument. So by combining the bends, by doing a lower bend followed by an upper bend, we're basically doing a gradual version and an immediate version back to back. And by doing that, to me, it's not exactly this physically, but it feels like making a little sine wave around the center of the note, and it feels like you've kind of stretched evenly to either side, and then you're back at equilibrium. And being at that equilibrium allows you to play with fluidity and ease, and focus on music rather than what's happening with your chops. So that's why I try to include these things in the early part of my practice and throughout the practice, as a way of making sure that I'm responsive to the airstream and feeling elastic in the center of my embouchure. So I hope that's helpful for you. Feel free to reach out with any questions about what I'm talking about. I'm happy to go into this kind of thing more, or continue on with more kind of deep explorations of what's in the book. And thank you again so much for being here on Patreon. And if you enjoy this, please share it with your friends, or share the Patreon page with your friends. And we'll see you next time. Thank you.